A small beggar girl invaded the courtroom and shouted to the judge, "Don't drink that water, it's poisoned." Upon realizing that the glass was almost empty, the girl revealed a secret that left everyone in shock. The clock on the kitchen wall marked 6 o'clock in the evening, when Avery finished setting the table for dinner. As she had done every day since her father's death 3 years ago, the 8-year-old girl carefully placed the cutlery exactly as her stepmother Stella demanded. Fork on the left, knife on the right, napkin folded in a triangular shape. Her brown hair was tied in a simple braid, and her faded blue dress had been mended so many times it was difficult to tell what the original fabric was. "I hope she's in a good mood today. I did everything the way she likes, cleaned the whole house and didn't break anything," thought Avery, as she adjusted the last detail on the table, a small vase with flowers picked from the backyard garden. The house where they lived wasn't big or luxurious, but Stella insisted on keeping up appearances for the neighbors. The always impeccably clean curtains hid what happened within those walls, a reality quite different from what Avery had known when her father was still alive. The pictures on the wall showed serene landscapes that contrasted with the tense atmosphere that constantly hung in the air. "Avery, where is that school report that arrived today? I've told you 1,000 times not to touch my mail." Stella's voice echoed through the house, causing the girl to involuntarily shudder. The stepmother entered the kitchen wearing an elegant grey dress, her hair perfectly arranged and makeup flawless, as if she were always ready to receive important visitors. Her high heels made a rhythmic sound on the floor that Avery had learned to recognize and fear. The girl quickly pointed to the untouched envelope on the counter, exactly where the mailman had left it. "It's there. I didn't touch anything, I swear. I just organized the other letters by size as you taught me," Avery replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the nervousness she always felt in her stepmother's presence. Dinner proceeded in silence as usual. Avery ate small portions, knowing that Stella didn't approve of her serving herself more than once. Meals, which should have been moments of family togetherness, had transformed into tense rituals where the girl desperately tried not to make mistakes. Outside, the sky was beginning to darken, and the first signs of the approaching storm could be heard in the distance. "I heard from your teacher that you're doing well in mathematics. At least that's something, considering all I spend on your education," Stella commented coldly, without really expecting an answer or showing any genuine pride. After dinner, while carefully washing the dishes to avoid breaking any plates, Avery listened to the sound of the television in the living room where Stella was watching her favorite program. The rain was beginning to fall outside, first a few timid drops, then quickly transforming into an intense downpour. The girl liked the sound of the rain. It was as if nature was singing a lullaby exclusively for her. "When you finish there, I want you to organize your drawers. That room of yours is a complete mess. I don't know how you managed to find anything in that disorder," Stella ordered, without taking her eyes off the screen. Already in her small room, Avery carefully organized her few clothes in the drawers. The space, which resembled more an adapted closet than a real bedroom, contained only a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a shelf with some school books. On the bedside table, in a simple frame, was the only photo she had with her father, both smiling on a picnic day, shortly before he fell ill. "Daddy, sometimes it's so hard without you here. I try to be good, do everything right, but it never seems enough for her to like me," Avery whispered to the photograph, as she did every night before sleeping. The storm intensified during the night, with lightning illuminating Avery's dark room every few minutes. The girl was sleeping restlessly when she was brutally awakened by Stella, who turned on the light and began rummaging through her newly organized drawers. Her stepmother's face was contorted in an expression Avery had never seen before, a mixture of anger and triumph, as if she had finally found the justification she was looking for. "Where is it? I know you took it." "Where did you hide the money that was in my drawer? Did you think I wouldn't notice, you little thief?" Stella shouted, throwing Avery's clothes onto the floor. Confused and frightened, Avery sat up in bed, trying to understand what was happening. Her eyes, still heavy with sleep, widened at the sight of her stepmother's furious state. The clock on the wall marked almost midnight, and the rain continued to fall mercilessly outside, as if sensing the even greater storm forming inside that house. "What money? I didn't take anything of yours, I swear." "I didn't even know you kept money in the drawer," replied Avery, her voice trembling with fear and confusion. Stella paused for a moment, staring at the girl with eyes that seemed to burn with hatred. Her hair, normally impeccable, was disheveled, and her labored breathing betrayed the state of nerves she was in. She held an empty wooden box, which she waved frantically in front of Avery's face. "Don't lie to me. Who else could have taken it? I live alone with you in this house. It was my savings from months of work, and now it's mysteriously disappeared. I always suspected you had this dishonest side, just like your father," she said coldly. The words about her father hit Avery like a slap. Never in all those difficult years had Stella spoken ill of her father. The girl felt tears welling up in her eyes, not just because of the unfair accusation, but because of the way her father's memory was being tarnished. She rose from the bed, her small hands trembling with indignation. "My father was honest. He would never take anything from anyone, and neither would I. Please believe me, I didn't take your money," begged Avery, realizing that something very serious was about to happen. Stella grabbed Avery by the arm, leading her down the dark hallway toward the front door. The rain now lashed at the windows with frightening violence, and the wind howled like a wounded animal. Avery stumbled, trying to keep up with her stepmother's long strides while pleading for her to reconsider. "I've already endured much more than I should have. Since your father died, you've brought me nothing but problems and expenses. I thought I could raise you to be a decent person, but I see that the bad blood of your dead mother speaks louder. Now you'll learn what happens to those who steal," she shouted. When they reached the front door, Stella finally released Avery's arm, only to open the lock. The icy wind laden with rain immediately invaded the hallway, causing the girl to shrink from the cold. Outside, the darkness was almost total, interrupted only by occasional lightning that revealed the deserted and flooded streets. "Please don't do this. It's raining too hard. I can sleep in the yard, in the garage, anywhere. But don't send me away like this," cried Avery, clinging to the doorframe with all the strength her small body allowed. With a final push, Stella forced Avery out of the house, causing the girl to fall to her knees on the wet sidewalk. Her thin nightclothes, just a nightgown and socks, were instantly soaked by the merciless rain. The teddy bear, which Avery had managed to grab at the last moment, was now as wet as she was. "Don't come back here. Now you'll learn to respect what isn't yours. Perhaps the streets will teach you the value of the roof I generously offered you all these years," shouted Stella, before slamming the door shut, leaving Avery alone in the storm. The rain fell like icy needles on Avery's fragile body, who remained motionless for a few minutes, unable to believe what had just happened. The lights in the house went out one by one until only darkness remained. The girl rose with difficulty, hugging her soaked teddy bear as if it were the only thing keeping her connected to the world. "What am I going to do now? Where can I go?" whispered Avery between sobs, as she began to walk aimlessly through the deserted streets of the sleeping city. The cutting wind made her teeth chatter uncontrollably, and her bare feet ached as she stepped on fallen stones and branches. Each step seemed more difficult than the last, as Avery moved away from the only home she had known in recent years. The rain transformed the streets into small rivers, and the girl had to be careful not to be swept away by the current forming in the gutters. "Daddy, if you can hear me from heaven, please help me. I'm so afraid and so alone," Avery prayed silently, looking up at the stormy sky as if expecting a divine sign. After walking for almost an hour, Avery spotted a large building with imposing architecture that she recognized as the city courthouse. There was a small marquee at the side entrance that seemed to offer some protection from the incessant rain. With the last of her remaining strength, the girl ran to the makeshift shelter, letting herself fall exhausted onto the cold marble floor. "At least here the rain can't reach me. Maybe tomorrow when it dawns I can find someone who can help me," thought Avery, trying to convince herself that her situation wasn't as desperate as it seemed. The marquee wasn't very large, but it offered enough protection from the rain. Avery curled up against the wall, trying to preserve what little heat remained in her trembling body. Your drenched clothes stuck to your skin, and your hair dripped, forming a small puddle around you. The hours passed slowly, and sleep, despite the discomfort and fear, began to overcome her. Tomorrow, everything will get better. Maybe the lady from the bakery who always smiles at me can help me. Or maybe Stella will realize I didn't take anything and come looking for me. Avery murmured, fighting against the weight of her eyelids that insisted on closing. It was in the middle of the night, when the rain finally began to subside, that Avery was awakened by male voices approaching. Instinctively, she curled up even more, hiding in the shadows of the awning. Two well-dressed men, protected by black umbrellas, stopped exactly in front of her hiding place, apparently looking for a private place to talk. "We cannot fail tomorrow. Judge Alexander needs to be eliminated before he pronounces the sentence." "Our client paid very well for this service," said one of the men, his deep and controlled voice sounding even more threatening in the silence of the early morning. Avery's heart raced as she realized she was witnessing something dangerous. She tried to control her breathing, fearing being discovered. The men seemed so focused on their conversation that they didn't notice the small figure hidden in the shadows. The girl knew she should flee, but her body seemed paralyzed by fear and exhaustion. "Everything is prepared. The poison in the water is undetectable and acts quickly. By the time they think of medical help, it will be too late. And with the substitute judge already bought, the verdict is guaranteed in favor of our businessman," replied the second man, his voice softer but equally threatening. Avery covered her mouth with her hands to prevent a moan of horror from escaping. Even at 8 years old, she understood that she was hearing plans to kill someone, a judge named Alexander. Her body began to tremble, not just from cold but from pure terror. Without realizing, she moved slightly, causing her teddy bear to fall to the ground with a dull thud. "What was that? Is someone here?" asked the first man, turning abruptly in Avery's direction. Lightning momentarily illuminated the awning, revealing the girl's huddled figure. The man's eyes widened when he realized they had been observed, and a sinister smile formed on his thin lips. He made a subtle gesture to his companion, indicating the presence of the unwanted witness. "We have a witness." "You know what to do," he whispered, beginning to slowly approach where Avery was hiding. Survival instinct finally overcame paralyzing fear, and Avery jumped up, running desperately away from the awning. Her bare feet painfully hit the wet ground, but terror gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Behind her, she could hear the men's footsteps, who weren't running but walking with a disturbing calmness, like predators, confident that their prey has no escape. "Judge Alexander needs to drink that poisoned water tomorrow, or our businessman will go to jail." "I already have the substitute judge bought to take over the case," she heard one of them say, as if not caring much about the street girl's witness, as if nobody would believe her, or as if she wasn't capable of fully understanding the gravity of the situation she had just witnessed. Understanding the danger, Avery ran until she lost her breath, turning at random corners to lose her pursuers. The rain had diminished to a fine drizzle, but the cold remained cutting. When she finally had the courage to look back and saw no one, she allowed herself to slow down. Her legs trembled from fatigue and fear, and only then did she realize she had lost her precious teddy bear in the desperate escape. "My God, what am I going to do now? Nobody will believe me. I'm just a girl who was kicked out of home, and they are important men," Avery thought, while looking for a new shelter to spend the rest of the night. In a narrow alley between two abandoned buildings, Avery found a cardboard box large enough to shelter in. Carefully, she entered the improvised refuge, curling up to try to conserve what little heat her body still produced. The wet clothes, empty stomach, and extreme tiredness combined into a discomfort that seemed unbearable, but the fear of what she had witnessed was even worse. "I need to warn someone. That judge will die if I do nothing. But who would believe me? I'm just a child and now a street child," Avery murmured, as fatigue finally overcame her resistance. The first rays of sunlight found Avery still sleeping in her improvised cardboard shelter. Her dreams were populated by shadowy men, poisoned water, and an unknown judge named Alexander. When she finally woke up, she felt every muscle in her body ache, as if she had been beaten. Her clothes were still damp, and hunger tightened her stomach into painful knots. "I need to find help. I need to tell someone what I heard last night. That judge cannot die because of me. I can't carry that guilt too," decided Avery, rising with difficulty and leaving her hiding place to face a new day and the biggest challenge of her young life. As she walked through streets that were beginning to come alive with dawn, Avery tried to organize her thoughts. A simple plan was beginning to form in her childish mind. She needed to reach the police station, tell what she had heard, and prevent a tragedy from happening. What she didn't yet know was that her appearance as a beggar, with dirty clothes and disheveled hair, would be the first obstacle in an almost impossible journey. I'll make it. I have to make it. Someone needs to believe me, even if I'm just a small girl alone in the world, Avery whispered to herself, gathering all the courage she could find in her wounded but still determined heart. The city streets came to life with the morning movement as Avery walked determinedly toward downtown. Her tired legs protested with each step, and her empty stomach emitted painful growls that she tried to ignore. The sun, which had finally appeared after the previous night's storm, couldn't warm her still damp and trembling body. Hurried people passed by her without a second glance, as if the girl were invisible or just part of the urban landscape they preferred not to see. It's as if I don't exist to them. Yesterday I was just a normal girl. Today I'm someone people avoid looking in the eyes, thought Avery, while trying to remember the way to the police station she had visited once with her father. After almost an hour of walking, Avery finally spotted the police station building. The red brick construction, with a stone staircase at the entrance and a flag waving at the top, seemed imposing and intimidating to the small girl. For a moment she hesitated, feeling her heart race with insecurity. What if they didn't believe her? What if they sent her away? Or worse, what if they sent her somewhere far away where she couldn't help Judge Alexander? I can't give up now. Someone needs to believe me. That judge will die if I don't do something, she muttered to herself, clenching her fists with a determination that contrasted with her fragile appearance. The police station staircase seemed endless to her exhausted legs, but Avery climbed each step with persistence. When she finally reached the entrance door, she needed to use both hands to push it open. The interior of the station was illuminated by fluorescent lights that hurt her eyes, accustomed to the dimness of her makeshift shelter. The shiny tiled floor reflected her deplorable image: tangled hair, dirty face, clothes still damp and stained. Remember what Dad always said, truth is more important than appearance. They need to hear me no matter how I look, Avery encouraged herself, as she timidly walked toward the service counter. Behind the high counter, a middle-aged police officer was filling out forms with a bored expression. He didn't raise his eyes when Avery approached, continuing to write as if no one was there. The girl stood on her tiptoes, trying to reach enough height to be seen. Her small, dirty hand tapped lightly on the counter surface, finally catching the man's attention, who looked up with visible irritation. "Please, officer, I really need to talk to someone. It's about a crime that's going to happen today. Something very serious I heard last night," said Avery, her voice coming out lower and more tremulous than she intended. The officer stared her up and down, his gaze moving from disbelief to contempt in a matter of seconds. His eyes lingered on her dirty clothes, disheveled hair, and bare, injured feet. Then, without any gentleness, he asked what a street girl like her was doing there so early, disturbing the authorities' work. The condescending tone made Avery shrink, but she took a deep breath, remembering the urgency of her mission. "I'm not a street girl, sir. I was kicked out of my home last night during the storm, but that doesn't matter now. What matters is that I heard 2 men planning to poison a judge today in court." "Judge Alexander," explained Avery, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear and hunger that tormented her body. The officer let out a dry laugh, looking around as if searching for colleagues to share what he considered a joke. His eyes returned to Avery with a dangerous gleam as he leaned over the counter, bringing his face closer to hers. The strong smell of coffee and cigarettes made the girl instinctively back away. "Look what we have here, a little liar seeking attention. I bet you ran away from home after causing trouble and now you're making up stories to play the victim. We don't have time for this, girl. There are people with real problems waiting for assistance," he said, his voice loaded with disdain. Avery felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, but she swallowed her crying. She couldn't afford the luxury of appearing even weaker or more childish. This was a matter of life and death, and she needed to make someone understand the gravity of the situation. With a courage she didn't know she possessed, she straightened her shoulders and looked directly into the policeman's eyes. "Please, I'm telling the truth. I heard everything clearly last night when I took shelter near the courthouse to escape the rain. 2 men in suits said they're going to poison Judge Alexander's water during today's trial. They mentioned they already have a substitute judge brought off to take over the case if something happens to him. It's a businessman who's being tried, Avery insisted, her voice gaining strength as she related the details of what she had heard. The policeman's expression changed subtly, not to belief, but with a calculating look that made Avery feel a shiver run down her spine. He stepped away from the counter and gestured for her to wait, while he headed to a room in the back. Avery felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps he was going to call someone who could help her, someone who would take her story seriously. Finally, someone's going to listen to me. Maybe there's still time to save Judge Alexander. Maybe everything will be all right after all. I don't want anyone else to die like what happened to Mom and Dad, she thought, allowing herself a small sigh of relief. Minutes later, the policeman returned accompanied by another man, older and with a larger badge on his chest. This second policeman had a stern expression, with deep wrinkles around his eyes and mouth that suggested years of hard work. He approached Avery with slow, measured steps, examining her as if she were a complex problem to be solved. "So, you're the girl who claims to have heard about a conspiracy to kill Judge Alexander? Quite a story for someone so small. What's your name and where are your parents?" he asked, his voice deep and authoritative. The question about her parents caught Avery off guard. A wave of sadness invaded her as she remembered her deceased father and the stepmother who had unfairly expelled her. But she knew she needed to focus on what was important at that moment. Lives were at risk, and her personal story would have to wait. "My name is Avery, sir. My father passed away 3 years ago, and my stepmother Stella kicked me out of the house last night, during the storm. But that's not important now. What's important is that I heard 2 men planning to kill Judge Alexander today, at the trial that's going to happen. Please, you need to believe me," she pleaded, her green eyes shining with contained tears. The older policeman crossed his arms, exchanging a meaningful look with his younger colleague. There was something in that look that increased Avery's discomfort. It wasn't disbelief, but something more calculated, as if they were evaluating what to do with her, not with the information she was bringing. "And why would your stepmother kick you out on a stormy night? You must have done something very serious, isn't that right? Perhaps you're a compulsive liar, or worse. Maybe you're here to distract us while your friends commit some crime in the city," suggested the older policeman, his tone falsely casual. Fear began to take hold of Avery. They weren't just ignoring her story, they were turning it against her, transforming the victim into a suspect. Her throat went dry, and she felt her legs trembling under the weight of fatigue and anxiety. Even so, she gathered strength to keep trying. "My stepmother accused me of stealing money from her, but I swear I didn't do that. I've never stolen anything from anyone. Please, I'm telling the truth about what I heard. 2 men very well dressed, planning to poison Judge Alexander today. They said they already have another judge bought off to replace him and give a favorable verdict to the businessman who's being tried," explained Avery, her voice becoming more desperate with each word. The younger policeman came around the counter, approaching Avery from behind. She could feel his threatening presence, though he didn't touch her. The older one leaned in again, his face inches from hers, with an expression that mixed authority and contempt. "Do you know what happens to people who make false accusations and disrupt police work, little one? They can be arrested. Even children like you can go to institutions where you'll learn not to lie and to respect authorities. Is that what you want?" he threatened, his voice low and controlled. Terror froze Avery's blood. Institutionalized, locked up. She had already heard terrible stories about orphanages and reformatories, places where children were treated as numbers, not people. But what frightened her most was the certainty that if they took her away, there would be absolutely no one to prevent Judge Alexander's poisoning. "I'm not lying. I swear on my father's memory. Please, you have to believe me. Someone's life is in danger. I don't care what happens to me. I just don't want to have someone's death on my conscience. I lost my daddy. That judge might have children, a mother, brothers. Someone who cares about him just like I cared about my daddy," Avery begged, tears finally escaping and tracing clean paths on her dirty face. The older police officer straightened up, adjusting his uniform with a studied gesture. His gaze now showed pure boredom, as if he had wasted too much time on this situation. He made a subtle gesture to his younger colleague, who immediately placed his hand on Avery's shoulder, squeezing hard enough to make it clear it wasn't a friendly touch. "I think we've heard enough of this absurd little story. Take her outside and make sure she understands not to come back unless she has something real to report. We have serious work to do here. We can't waste time on a lying brat's fantasies," he ordered, turning his back and returning to the back room without a second glance. The grip on Avery's shoulder tightened as the younger officer guided her, or rather pushed her, toward the exit. Her small feet could barely keep up with the man's large strides. Humiliation burned in her chest like fire, mixing with growing desperation. The clock on the wall showed 11 in the morning. Only 3 hours remained until the trial began. "Please, just verify what I'm saying. Send someone to the courthouse. Watch the water that will be served to Judge Alexander. It costs nothing to check and it could save a life," Avery tried to argue, her voice almost inaudible under the noise of the police station. When they reached the door, the officer finally released her shoulder, only to open the door. The bright morning sun hit Avery's face, making her blink uncomfortably. Before she could say anything else, she felt strong hands pushing her outside, almost making her fall down the steps. "Don't come back here with your lies, girl. Next time, we'll call Child Protective Services, and you'll find out that life on the streets is much better than life in an institution for juvenile offenders. Now get out of here before I change my mind and decide to take you there right now," threatened the officer, his face contorted in an expression of absolute contempt. The police station door closed with a bang that seemed to seal Judge Alexander's fate. Avery remained standing for a few moments, her wobbly legs threatening to give way under the weight of failure. Silent tears ran down her face as the reality of her powerlessness hit her with full force. How could a simple girl, dirty and hungry, face an entire system that refused to listen to her? "What do I do now, Daddy? Nobody believes me. Nobody will help Judge Alexander, and it's all my fault for not being able to make anyone take me seriously," she whispered to the sky, as if her father could hear her and send an answer. Avery's stomach painfully growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten anything since dinner the night before. Hunger, combined with fatigue and emotional stress, made her head spin. She slowly descended the steps of the police station, trying to decide what her next move would be. She couldn't simply give up, not when she knew a life was at stake. "Maybe I can go directly to the courthouse and try to talk to Judge Alexander before the trial. But how will I get in there? How will I get past the security guards? They'll probably treat me worse than the police did," Avery thought as she walked aimlessly along the sidewalk in front of the station. It was then that an idea began to form in her mind. If she couldn't make the authorities believe her, perhaps she could take matters into her own hands. She could go to the courthouse and find a way to get in, perhaps through a service entrance or an open window. It was risky and scary, but what choice did she have? No one else would do anything to prevent the approaching tragedy. "I have to try, even if it's dangerous. If I do nothing and Judge Alexander dies, I'll never forgive myself. I will never be able to sleep peacefully again knowing I could have done something," Avery decided, a new gleam of determination appearing in her green eyes. The clock in the central square showed noon when Avery finally reached the vicinity of the courthouse. The imposing marble building, with its tall columns and majestic staircase, seemed even more intimidating in daylight. Well-dressed people, lawyers with their briefcases, hurried employees, journalists with equipment, entered and exited through its main doors. The contrast between them and Avery couldn't be greater. How will I manage to get in there? I'm practically invisible to these people, unless they see me as a threat or a nuisance. I need to find another way, she muttered to herself as she circled the building, looking for a less guarded entrance. After circling the perimeter of the courthouse, Avery found a small side door, probably used by cleaning or maintenance staff. Some workers were entering and exiting carrying equipment without paying much attention to the movement around them. It was her chance. She could try to blend in, go unnoticed, or simply run inside when no one was looking. It's too risky. If they catch me, they'll throw me out immediately, and maybe even hand me over to the police. But what other option do I have? I can't stay out here while an innocent man is being poisoned in there, reflected Avery, hiding behind a tree while observing the movement. The clock moved forward mercilessly, and Avery knew she needed to make a decision. It was then that she noticed something that made her heart race. An elegant black car parked near the main entrance of the courthouse, and from it emerged two well-dressed men carrying a briefcase. With horror, she recognized them immediately. They were the same men she had seen the night before, the conspirators who were planning to poison Judge Alexander. It's them! They're here to do what they planned. My God, I need to get in now no matter how. I can't let them do this, Avery exclaimed to herself, her body trembling with fear and adrenaline. With her eyes fixed on the two men, Avery saw them climbing the courthouse stairs with the confidence of those who are certain of impunity. One of them carried a black briefcase that she had no doubt contained the poison mentioned the night before. A glance at the public clock in the square showed her that it was exactly 1:30, just half an hour until the start of the trial. Time is running out. It's now or never. I have to get in, even if they arrest me afterward. At least I will have tried, Avery decided, gathering all the courage she could find in her child's heart. While watching the two men disappear inside the courthouse, Avery noticed an unusual movement at the side entrance. A group of school children, accompanied by a teacher, were forming a line to enter the building, probably an educational visit to the courthouse. Children of various ages, all wearing clean and organized school uniforms, patiently waited their turn. This might be my only chance. If I can blend in with them, maybe I can enter unnoticed. It's risky, but I need to try, thought Avery, moving quickly toward the end of the line. With her heart beating so hard it seemed to want to jump out of her mouth, Avery approached the group of students, trying to appear casual. Her appearance was completely different from the other children. Dirty and wrinkled clothes instead of impeccable uniforms, disheveled hair instead of neat hairstyles, bare feet instead of polished shoes. Even so, she positioned herself at the end of the line, keeping her head down to avoid curious glances. If anyone asks, I'll say I got separated from the group, or that I'm looking for the bathroom. Anything that allows me to enter, even if just for a few minutes, Avery planned, as the line began to move toward the entrance. Miraculously, the confusion of the group of children, some of them chatting animatedly among themselves, distracted the attention of the security guards at the door. The teacher, busy maintaining order among the more agitated students, didn't notice the extra figure that had joined the end of the line. With each step she took toward the entrance, Avery felt a mixture of terror and hope. She was about to enter the courthouse, but what would she do afterward? Once inside, I need to find the courtroom. I need to prevent Judge Alexander from drinking anything. Even if they don't believe me, I need to do something that draws attention, that interrupts the procedure, Avery decided, passing through the side door of the courthouse without being questioned. Once inside the building, Avery discreetly separated from the school group, hiding behind a column while observing the movement. The interior of the courtroom was impressive: polished marble floors, high ceilings with elegant chandeliers, walls covered in fine wood. Well-dressed people walked hurriedly in all directions, no one paying attention to the small dirty figure who didn't belong in that environment. How will I find the right room? There must be dozens of courtrooms in this place, worried Avery, looking around for some indication. It was then that she noticed a large bulletin board on the wall, listing the day's trials and their respective rooms. Cautiously approaching, Avery scanned the list with her eyes until she found what she was looking for. Room 3, 2 o'clock. Judge Alexander Thompson. Business case. Her heart leaped. She was on the right track. Now she just needed to find room 3 before it was too late. Room 3, Assessor. Where is that? I need to be quick, but I can't draw attention by running through the corridors, muttered Avery, as she followed the signage indicating the direction of the courtrooms. The courthouse corridors seemed like a labyrinth to Avery, who tried to remain discreet while desperately searching for room 3. Each time an employee or security guard looked in her direction, she pretended to be waiting for someone, or simply lowered her head and continued walking with determination, as if she knew exactly where she was going. The clock on the wall showed 13:50, just 10 minutes until the trial began. I'm running out of time. Please, I need to find this room before it's too late. Before those men managed to poison Judge Alexander, prayed Avery, turning another corner in the maze of corridors. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Avery spotted a sign indicating rooms 1 to 5 with an arrow. Following the indication, she reached a wider corridor where small groups of people were talking in low voices, outside imposing double doors. Slowly, she passed by each door, reading the numbers, until she found room 3. Through the partially open doors, she could see people already settling inside. Lawyers organizing papers, journalists adjusting equipment, the public occupying gallery seats. The time has come. I don't know how I'm going to do this, but I need to get in there and prevent Judge Alexander from drinking anything. Even if they arrest me afterward, even if nobody believes me, I need to try, decided Avery, taking a deep breath to calm her racing heart. With legs trembling from fear and determination, Avery approached the door of room 3. Through the opening, she could see the formal layout of a courtroom, the elevated judge's bench at the back, the defense and prosecution tables, the jury seats, the public gallery. Her gaze immediately fixed on the judge's bench, where a middle-aged man with graying hair, wearing a black robe, was organizing some papers. Next to him, a glass of water had already been placed, innocently gleaming under the courtroom lights. So that must be Judge Alexander, and that glass might be poisoned. I need to stop him from drinking before it's too late, whispered Avery to herself, as a gong sounded, announcing the imminent start of the session. The gong sounded for the second time, indicating there were only 2 minutes left until the official start of the session. Avery felt her heart beating so hard it seemed to want to escape from her chest. The small opening in the door of room 3 functioned as a window to the scene that was about to unfold, a tragedy that only she knew was in progress. Her eyes couldn't look away from the water glass on Judge Alexander's bench, an object so common and harmless in appearance, but which she knew contained silent death within. The seconds seemed to drag on as her desperate mind searched for a plan. If I simply enter shouting, they'll throw me out before I can explain. But if I wait any longer, it might be too late. What do I do? How can I save this man who doesn't even know me? Mumbled Avery to herself, her small hands gripping the doorframe so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The courtroom was now almost completely full, with lawyers adjusting their robes, journalists discreetly positioning their equipment, and the public occupying the last available seats in the gallery. Avery observed as a distinguished-looking man entered through a side door and took his place at the defendant's table. It must be the businessman mentioned by the conspirators, the man for whom they planned to kill the judge. His expression was serene, almost too confident, as if he already knew the verdict would be favorable to him, regardless of the evidence presented. He knows what's going to happen. Look at how he smiles, as if he has already won. He's waiting for the moment when Judge Alexander will fall, and another judge will take his place. A bought judge, as they said last night, thought Avery, feeling a wave of indignation momentarily replace her fear. It was then that she noticed for the first time the figure of the clerk sitting near the judge's bench. With a shock of recognition, Avery identified him as one of the men she had seen the previous night under the marquee, the same man who had later entered the courthouse carrying the suspicious briefcase. Miles, as they called him, maintained a neutral and professional expression, but Avery could perceive the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes continuously shifted toward the water glass on Judge Alexander's desk. The horror of the situation hit her with renewed force. The assassin wasn't an intruder, but someone from within the system, someone in a position of trust. It's him. It's the clerk. He's one of them. He's on the businessman's side. He's the one who put the poison in Judge Alexander's water, Avery almost shouted, restraining herself at the last second, remembering that she needed a better plan than simply making accusations from the doorway. The third and final gong sounded, and everyone in the room stood in respect as Judge Alexander officially took his place. He was a man of dignified presence, with expression lines that spoke of years of experience and wisdom. His eyes, behind thin-framed glasses, revealed a sharp intelligence and a sense of justice that naturally emanated from his posture. He organized some papers before him, and then, with an almost automatic gesture, extended his hand toward the water glass. No, he's going to drink. I have to do something now, no matter what happens to me afterward, decided Avery, feeling a desperate courage take hold of her exhausted and hungry body. Time seemed to move in slow motion as Avery watched Judge Alexander's hand approach the fatal glass. Each passing second was 1 second closer to tragedy. The entire room was in respectful silence, waiting for the judge to formally begin the session. No one but her seemed to notice the anxious look that Clerk Miles cast toward the glass. the way he seemed to count the seconds for the plan to materialize. The defendant businessman, seated at his table, maintained a studied calm, but a small smile threatened to form at the corner of his lips. I can't let this happen. Even if they arrest me, even if nobody believes me, I have to try. A life is worth more than my fear, Avery whispered to herself, gathering a courage that seemed too big for her small and weakened body. Without thinking twice, Avery pushed the door with all the strength she could muster. The hinges protested with a loud creak, causing several heads to turn in her direction. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, the small, dirty and disheveled figure standing at the threshold of the door, dramatically contrasting with the impeccable solemnity of the judicial environment. Judge Alexander, with the glass already on its way to his lips, paused for a moment, his eyes meeting Avery's with an expression of surprise. "Your Honor, don't drink that water. It's poisoned. They want to kill you," shouted Avery with all the strength of her lungs, her childish voice echoing off the marble walls of the courtroom. A stunned silence followed for a second that seemed endless before the room exploded in exclamations of shock and indignation. Judge Alexander, apparently more curious than alarmed, kept the glass suspended in the air, looking with interest at the ragged girl who had just made such an extraordinary accusation. Clark Miles, on the other hand, had partially risen from his chair, his face a mask of poorly disguised alarm. "How dare you interrupt a judicial session, girl? Guards, remove this child immediately," shouted someone from the prosecution bench, his voice overriding the growing murmur that took hold of the room. Chaos instantly erupted. Voices of astonishment and indignation rose throughout the room as Avery ran desperately down the central aisle toward the judge's bench. Two security guards reacted immediately, moving to intercept her, but the girl was small and agile, sliding between people with the dexterity of someone fighting for life, not her own, but that of a stranger who didn't even know he was in danger. "Please listen to me. They put poison in your water. I heard everything last night. They have a bought substitute judge ready to take over the case." Avery continued to shout as she got closer and closer to the judge's bench. People in the public gallery began to stand up, some out of curiosity, others out of indignation. A growing murmur filled the air, with theories being instantly formed about who this child was and what her absurd accusation meant. A defense lawyer was shouting for order, while journalists quickly grabbed their notepads, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. "Remove this disturbed girl from here. This is outrageous. A clear attempt to obstruct justice," bellowed the defendant businessman's lawyer, his face red with apparent indignation, but his eyes betraying a growing panic. Judge Alexander remained surprisingly calm amid the commotion, observing the scene with an intrigued expression, rather than an alarmed one. He put the glass back on the table, but Avery noticed with horror that the water level was already significantly lower than she had initially seen. He had already drunk part of the contents before her arrival. This explained why he had not yet shown the effects of the poison, but it was only a matter of time. "Your Honor, have you drunk from the water? You need medical help immediately." "That man, the Clark Miles, he put poison for you to die during the trial," shouted Avery, frantically pointing at the clerk, who now displayed a visible paleness on his normally impassive face. Clark Miles stood up completely, his face alternating between paleness and redness. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to maintain his composure, looking around as if searching for support or an escape route. His eyes briefly met those of the defendant businessman, a silent communication passing between them, before both assumed expressions of offended indignation. "This is absurd, a monstrous accusation. This child obviously needs psychiatric help," protested Miles, his voice higher and more strident than normal, betraying his nervousness despite his attempt to appear offended. Before he could say anything more, Avery felt strong hands grabbing her arms, lifting her off the ground as if she weighed no more than a feather. The security guards had finally reached her and now immobilized her with professional efficiency. "Let me go, I'm not lying. Why doesn't anyone believe me? He'll die if you do nothing. Please just test the water, verify what I'm saying," begged Avery, her small body uselessly writhing against the firm grip of the guards. One of the guards, a tall man with a severe expression, leaned in to speak directly into Avery's ear, his voice low and threatening, audible only to her. His hot, unpleasant breath made the girl turn her face, trying to escape not only the words, but the intimidating proximity. "Keep quiet, brat. You don't know what you're getting into. Important people are involved in this, and you are nothing. If you continue with this shouting, you'll find out what happens to children who interfere in adult matters," he threatened, squeezing Avery's arm even tighter to emphasize his message. Judge Alexander finally spoke up, his deep and controlled voice cutting through the tumult that had taken over the room. He raised his hand, calling for silence, and surprisingly, order was quickly restored. All eyes alternated between the judge and the small intruder, who now struggled in the grip of the security guards, less than 5 meters from the main bench. "Young lady, this is a court of justice, not a playground for your fantasies. Interrupting a trial is a serious offense, even for someone your age. Guards, please remove this girl and find her guardians," ordered the judge, his voice betraying only slight irritation, as if the incident were more an inconvenience than a desperate attempt to save his life. A woman from the gallery, apparently touched by the small beggar's situation, stood up timidly. Her face showed genuine concern, as if she were the only person in the room who considered that perhaps, just perhaps, there was something more to this story than simple childish delusions. She nervously adjusted her glasses before speaking, her voice almost disappearing under the weight of the gazes that turned to her. "Your Honor, if I may, perhaps we should hear what the girl has to say. She seems to genuinely believe what she's saying and, well, what harm would it do to just check the water?" suggested the woman, shrinking slightly when several disapproving looks turned in her direction. The businessman defendant's lawyer immediately stood up, his face a mask of calculated indignation. He adjusted his expensive tie before speaking, as if he needed the extra time to carefully compose his words. His eyes avoided meeting Avery's, focusing exclusively on Judge Alexander, who was beginning to show subtle signs of discomfort, occasionally passing his hand across his forehead. "Your Honor, this is clearly an attempt to delay or interrupt these proceedings. My client is a respectable man who has already suffered enough with unfounded accusations. I suggest we proceed immediately and that this disturbance be dealt with by the competent authorities," he argued, his mellifluous voice carrying an authority that seemed to disarm any opposition. Avery felt despair growing inside her as she realized she was being completely ignored. Worse, she was being treated like a troubled child who had made up an absurd story to get attention. The security guards began dragging her back toward the door as she continued to struggle and scream. Her gaze caught the court clerk Miles's expression, a mixture of relief and concern that only confirmed her suspicions. "You don't understand. I heard them planning everything last night, during the storm. They said Judge Alexander needed to die so the businessman wouldn't go to jail. Please, just test the water before it's too late," Avery pleaded, her voice beginning to fail from exhaustion and hunger that hadn't ceased since the day before. Clerk Miles discreetly wiped away a drop of sweat trickling down his temple, his eyes constantly darting to the clock on the wall. He compulsively reorganized the papers in front of him, a nervous tick that betrayed his apparent professional calm. For a moment his eyes met Avery's, and she saw something in them that confirmed all her fears, a mixture of guilt and cold determination that made her blood freeze. "Your Honor, I apologize for this regrettable interruption. If I may, I can call social services to deal with this clearly disturbed child while we proceed with our important work," offered Miles, his voice studiously solicitous, but with a shadow of anxiety that only Avery seemed able to detect. As she was being dragged toward the exit, Avery watched in horror as Judge Alexander suddenly brought his hand to his forehead, as if feeling a sudden dizziness. It was a subtle gesture, almost imperceptible to anyone not looking for signs, but to Avery it was as if an alarm had sounded. The first effects of the poison were beginning to manifest, exactly as she feared. The judge tried to disguise his discomfort, straightening up in his chair and clearing his throat before resuming proceedings. "It's starting. Look at him. He's not feeling well. It's the poison working. Please, somebody do something," Avery shouted with renewed urgency, her words echoing through the room that was now returning to its previous solemnity. A young reporter who was furiously taking notes at the back of the room looked more carefully at the judge, noticing the signs of discomfort that the magistrate was trying to hide. His journalistic instinct alerted him that something unusual was happening, something that went beyond the simple interruption caused by a lost child. He leaned toward his colleague, whispering observations that were received with skepticism but also with growing curiosity. "Look how pale the judge is, and that clerk seems too nervous. Don't you find it strange?" "What if the girl is telling the truth?" murmured the young reporter, his words getting lost in the formal resumption of proceedings, but planting a seed of doubt that would begin to grow in the following minutes. The security guards lifted her even higher, practically carrying her through the air toward the door, making her efforts to break free completely useless. Avery could feel the looks of contempt and irritation from those present, as if she were a disturbed intruder who didn't even deserve consideration. Even some lawyers who should be defenders of truth and justice looked at her with expressions ranging from disdain to condescending pity. "Please don't take me out of here yet. Judge Alexander is going to die and you're not doing anything." "I know it sounds crazy, but I'm telling the truth. Why would a child make up something like this?" cried Avery, her voice increasingly weak in the face of collective indifference. The security guard holding her left arm leaned in again, his grip becoming painfully tighter. His voice was just a harsh whisper, but loaded with a threat that made Avery shudder, despite all her determination. There was something in his eyes suggesting he wasn't just a zealous employee, but perhaps part of the conspiracy she was trying to expose. "Stop screaming, you brat. Nobody believes beggars, much less kid beggars. If you don't shut up now, I'll personally ensure you disappear into some reformatory where no one will ever hear your stories again," he threatened, his hot breath making Avery turn her face away in disgust. Through the tears that blurred her vision, Avery saw Judge Alexander trying to continue the proceedings, but now his movements seemed slower, less coordinated. He stopped mid-sentence as if he had forgotten what he was saying, and then brought his hand to his forehead again. This time the gesture was more obvious, and some of those present began to exchange concerned looks. Clark Miles kept his eyes fixed on his papers, deliberately avoiding looking at the judge or the girl who continued to accuse him. "Look at him. He's getting worse. And look at the clerk. He can't even face the judge. He knows what he did," Avery shouted, gathering her last strength for a final attempt to convince someone in the room. The prosecution attorney, who until then had been observing the scene with distant professional interest, began to pay more attention to Judge Alexander. His years of courtroom experience had made him sensitive to details, to subtle changes in the environment that others might not notice. And now, something definitely seemed wrong with the judge. His normally flushed face was taking on an unusual pallor, and his hands, always steady, now trembled slightly as he held the documents. "Your Honor, are you feeling well? Perhaps we should take a brief recess in the proceedings," suggested the prosecution attorney, his voice polite but firm, showing a concern that began to spread among those present. Already near the door, the security guards paused for a moment, when a murmur of concern began to spread through the room. Judge Alexander was now visibly pale, beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the air conditioning in the room. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to organize the papers before him, and his breathing seemed increasingly labored. One of the prosecution attorneys stood up, asking if His Honor was feeling well. "I am perfectly, by just a little indisposed," replied Judge Alexander, his voice now slurred and weak, very different from the serene authority he had demonstrated minutes before. The defendant businessman exchanged a quick look with his lawyer, a silent communication that did not go unnoticed by the young reporter, who was now observing the scene with growing suspicion. The businessman maintained a neutral expression, but his fingers drummed nervously on the table in front of him, betraying his apparent calm. For a moment, his eyes met Miles, and something like an imperceptible nod was exchanged between them. "Continue as planned. Do nothing to draw attention. The effect is beginning exactly as promised," that look seemed to say, though no word was spoken aloud. The security guards resumed their task of removing Avery from the room, dragging her into the hallway as she continued to scream and struggle. With each step they took toward the exit, Avery felt as if she were abandoning Judge Alexander to his fate, as if she were failing in the only important mission she had ever had in her life. Her eyes could not turn away from the figure of the judge, who now seemed to be struggling to remain conscious, while trying to proceed with the trial. "You can't do this. You're letting a murderer go free while treating the victim like a criminal." "Please, someone has to believe me," pleaded Avery, tears flowing freely down her dirty face marked by fatigue. The woman in the gallery who had previously spoken up was now standing again, her initial shyness replaced by a growing concern that could no longer be contained. She pointed to Judge Alexander, whose condition seemed to deteriorate with each passing second. Her voice, previously hesitant, now sounded clear and alarmed, cutting through the tension that filled the room. "Look at the judge. He is really sick. The girl might be right. Someone needs to call a doctor immediately, and please, someone check that water," she insisted, her courage lending strength to others who were beginning to share her suspicions. Clark Miles rose abruptly, dropping some papers from his desk in the process. His face now alternated between a sickly pallor and red patches of panic. He adjusted his tie as if it were choking him, and his eyes frantically scanned the room like a cornered animal desperately looking for an escape route. "This is ridiculous. We are allowing a street child and a hysterical spectator to interrupt an extremely important judicial process. Your Honor, I suggest we end this charade and proceed with the case," he protested, his voice betraying an urgency that seemed disproportionate to the situation. The courtroom door was just a few steps away now. Once outside, Avery knew her chances of saving Judge Alexander would be practically nil. With a last desperate effort, she twisted her body and managed to turn enough to look once more into the courtroom. It was at that moment that she saw Judge Alexander visibly stagger, his hand dropping some papers as he tried to support himself on the desk. Clark Miles, instead of showing concern, seemed to be discreetly calculating how long it would take for the poison to take full effect. "It's him! Look at Clark Miles. He's not even trying to help the judge. He's the one who put poison in the water," shouted Avery, using her last strength to point directly at the clerk. The gazes in the room began to divide between Judge Alexander, who was now visibly struggling to remain conscious, and Clark Miles, whose reaction seemed increasingly suspicious. The prosecuting attorney, moved both by concern for the judge and professional instinct, made a quick decision. He approached the judge's bench and, without asking permission, took the partially empty glass, examining it carefully. "There's something strange about this water. It has an almost imperceptible odor, but it's definitely not normal. We need medical assistance immediately, and this glass needs to be analyzed," he announced, his authoritative voice finally transforming the growing concern into concrete action. Miles, seeing that his position was rapidly deteriorating, made a move toward the side exit of the courtroom. His eyes betrayed the growing panic, and his hand unconsciously moved toward the inner pocket of his jacket, as if looking for something, perhaps the vial that had contained the poison, evidence he desperately needed to hide or destroy. "This is outrageous. I'm being defamed by a street child. I will not remain here to be insulted in this manner," he protested, his voice now several tones higher than normal, almost shrill in his desperation. At the exact moment the security guards dragged her out of the room, Avery saw Judge Alexander finally succumb. His eyes rolled back, and he fell heavily onto his desk, knocking over the water glass that shattered on the marble floor. The sound of breaking glass seemed amplified in the sudden silence that took hold of the room. All eyes turned first to the fallen judge, and then slowly to Clark Miles, who was now as pale as a ghost, his eyes wide with panic, as he realized that all attention was turning to him. "Do something. Don't let an innocent person die. The judge must have a family, someone who loves him. Please help him," Avery shouted one last time, before the door closed behind her, separating her from the chaos that now exploded inside the courtroom. The door closed with a heavy sound behind Avery, muffling the screams and confusion that took over the courtroom. The security guards dragged her down a long, cold corridor, their boots echoing on the polished marble floor. She still struggled, but with less strength now, exhausted by the effort and the hunger that gnawed at her stomach. Her tears had dried, leaving clean tracks on her dirty face. Despair was beginning to give way to a sense of overwhelming defeat. She had tried, had done everything she could, but it seemed it hadn't been enough to save Judge Alexander. "I tried, Dad. I did everything I could to save that man. Why did no one believe me until it was too late? Why don't people listen to children even when we speak the truth?" thought Avery, as she was dragged away from the only place where she could have made a difference. The guards took her to a small room at the back of the courthouse, an austere space with only a simple table and a few chairs. The plain white walls increased the feeling of isolation and abandonment. Without any gentleness, they pushed her inside and closed the door, leaving her alone with her thoughts and her failure. Avery could hear the distant sound of sirens approaching, probably the ambulance coming to get Judge Alexander. Would it be too late? Had she completely failed in her desperate mission? That poor man, he might be dying right now while they lock me up here as if I were the criminal. And that horrible clerk, Miles, will probably escape. It's not fair. None of this is fair, murmured Avery, hugging her trembling body as she sat on the cold floor, without the strength to reach one of the chairs. Time passed slowly in the small room. Avery could hear occasional voices and hurried footsteps in the corridor outside, but no one came in to check on her. Her stomach growled painfully, reminding her that she hadn't eaten anything since the day before. Physical and emotional exhaustion began to take its toll, and her eyes grew heavier and heavier. I was almost falling into a restless sleep when the sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway finally broke the oppressive silence, and the door opened, revealing two men in suits and a woman carrying a folder. "So you're the girl who caused all that commotion in court. We have some questions for you, and I suggest you answer with the truth if you know what's best for you," said the older of the men, his tone cold and calculating as he pulled a chair and sat across from Avery. Avery swallowed hard, intimidated by the presence of the three authority figures who now stared at her with severe expressions. The woman opened her folder and removed a small recorder, placing it on the table and activating it with an audible click. The second man remained standing, arms crossed, as if standing guard. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating, charged with suspicion and hostility. "My name is Avery, and I was telling the truth. Judge Alexander was poisoned by Clerk Miles. I heard them planning everything last night during the storm. Please believe me before it's too late," Avery pleaded, her voice small but determined despite the fear she felt growing inside her. The older man exchanged a meaningful look with his colleagues, a skeptical smile forming at the corner of his lips. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, studying Avery, as if she were a curious specimen under a microscope. His expression made it clear that he didn't believe a word she was saying, and this made her heart sink even further. "Quite a story for such a small child. Tell me, who put you up to this? Was it the prosecution team? Were they so desperate to bring down the businessman that they recruited a beggar to create this circus? Or perhaps you're just a disturbed girl seeking attention?" He questioned, each word dripping with disdain, testing her, looking for holes in her story. Avery felt a wave of indignation momentarily replace her fear. How could they think she was lying or being manipulated? She was risking everything to save a stranger's life, and yet they continued to treat her like a criminal or a liar. She straightened her shoulders, gathering what little dignity she had left, and looked directly into the investigator's eyes. "Nobody put me up to anything. I was kicked out of my home by my stepmother Stella during yesterday's storm. She falsely accused me of stealing money. I sought shelter near the forum and ended up overhearing two men planning to poison Judge Alexander. One of them was definitely Clerk Miles. I recognized him today in court," Avery stated, her voice gaining strength as she related her truth. The woman, who until then had remained silent, made some notes on her pad. Her face was harder to read, neither openly hostile like the older man's, nor completely skeptical. There was something in her eyes that suggested that maybe, just maybe, she was willing to consider the possibility that Avery was telling the truth. "If you really heard this conversation, as you say, you should be able to tell us exactly what was said. Specific words, Avery. Not just vague impressions or conclusions you drew," the woman requested, her tone professional but considerably gentler than her colleagues. Avery closed her eyes for a moment, concentrating on retrieving every detail of that terrible night. The words she had heard were engraved in her memory, each syllable preserved by the sheer terror she had felt, hidden in the shadows of the marquee. When she opened her eyes again, her expression was one of absolute certainty. "Clerk Miles said exactly, 'Judge Alexander needs to drink that poisoned water tomorrow or our businessman goes to jail.' And the other man replied, 'I already have the substitute judge brought to take over the case.' They talked about how the poison was undetectable and would act quickly during the trial. Miles said that Judge Alexander would never accept a bribe because he was known for his integrity, so eliminating him was the only option, Avery reported, each word coming out clear and firm, without hesitation. The older man frowned, apparently bothered by Avery's confidence and coherence in her account. He leaned back in his chair, assessing her with narrowed eyes, as if looking for any sign that she was lying or reciting something rehearsed. His younger colleague, still standing, seemed less certain of her guilt now, exchanging questioning looks with the woman. A well-crafted story, I must admit, but still, it's the word of a street child against that of a respected court official. Miles has worked in the judicial system for more than 20 years, without a single blemish on his record. Why should we believe you? Challenged the investigator, his tone still skeptical, but with a note of genuine curiosity emerging behind the hostility. The door opened abruptly, and a fourth officer hurriedly entered the room. He whispered something in the older man's ear, whose eyebrows rose in evident surprise. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly, the hostile tension giving way to something more complex. The lead investigator looked at Avery with an entirely new expression, a mixture of astonishment and reassessment. Judge Alexander has been confirmed as a victim of poisoning. Preliminary analyses of the remaining content in the glass indicate the presence of a sophisticated, toxic substance. And more importantly, the courthouse security cameras show Miles handling the judge's water when no one was looking. "It seems your story just gained some credibility, girl," he informed her, his tone completely transformed. The woman immediately closed her folder and turned off the recorder, repositioning it to start a new recording. Her look at Avery was now one of genuine interest and even a touch of admiration. The younger man pulled up a chair and sat down, his defensive posture completely abandoned. It was as if, in a matter of seconds, Avery had gone from suspect to key witness. "Avery, we need every detail you can remember now. Your story has been corroborated by preliminary evidence, and Judge Alexander is fighting for his life in the hospital. Any information you have might be crucial not just for the case but for saving his life," explained the woman, offering Avery a bottle of water and a packet of cookies she took from her bag. Avery accepted the water and cookies with gratitude, suddenly realizing how hungry and dehydrated she was. As she ate, she tried to organize her thoughts, determined not to omit any detail that might help save Judge Alexander and bring those responsible to justice. A strange feeling came over her. For the first time since being kicked out of home, someone was actually listening to her, believing her. There was one more thing, something that might help. When they realized I was there, I started to run. But before I got completely away, I heard Miles say something about where he would hide the poison vial. He wanted to keep it as evidence to ensure his payment, recalled Avery, frowning in concentration to recover the exact words. The older man leaned forward, suddenly very interested. His previous skepticism had given way to focused professional attention. The gravity of the situation seemed to have finally fully settled in the room. A judge had been poisoned in open court, and the only person who had crucial information about the conspiracy was an 8-year-old girl whom everyone had initially dismissed. Where, Avery? Where did he say he would hide the vial? This could be exactly the kind of physical evidence we need to build a solid case against Miles and whoever else is involved, pressed the investigator, his tone now urgent, almost pleading. Avery closed her eyes again, concentrating intensely. The memory came like a flash. That terrible moment when her teddy bear had fallen, revealing her presence, and the hurried words exchanged between the conspirators before she fled into the rainy night. She opened her eyes, a spark of triumph shining through the fatigue. He said, "I'll hide the vial in my office inside the plant pot, behind the 3rd criminal law book." The other man seemed worried, but Miles assured him that no one would ever look there, and that he needed to keep the vial as a guarantee to receive the rest of the payment, recalled Avery, each word coming out clear and confident. The impact of Avery's words was immediate. The younger man was already on the phone, relaying the information to a team that was apparently ready to act. The woman was taking notes furiously, while the lead investigator observed Avery with an expression that mixed admiration and perplexity. It wasn't every day that a homeless child single-handedly dismantled an elaborate criminal conspiracy. "If we find that vial where you indicated, it will be the definitive proof we need," Such a specific detail couldn't be invented or planted. Avery, do you understand the importance of what you're doing? You're facing powerful people, people who wouldn't hesitate to do anything to protect their interests, explained the investigator, his tone now carrying a note of genuine concern for the girl's well-being. The minutes that followed were tense, with everyone in the room awaiting news from the team that had been sent to Miles's office. Avery ate a few more cookies, feeling a renewed strength, not just from the food but from the sensation that she was finally being heard and valued. The silence was broken by the shrill ring of the telephone, which the younger man answered immediately, listening attentively before hanging up with an expression of triumph. They found exactly where she said. The vial was hidden in the plant pot, behind the third criminal law book on the shelf in Miles's office. But there's more. They also found a folder with documents detailing the entire scheme. Bank transfers, coded communications with the businessman, even the name of the substitute judge who would take over the case after Judge Alexander's death, he reported, barely containing the excitement in his voice. The room exploded into activity. The woman immediately began making calls, organizing teams to arrest other suspects mentioned in the documents. The younger man quickly left to coordinate the operation on site. The lead investigator remained with Avery, his expression now completely transformed. Where before there was disdain, now there was respect, and even a touch of regret for the way they had initially treated her. Avery, you just gave us the evidence needed to dismantle what appears to be one of the biggest judicial corruption schemes in this city. What you did today wasn't just brave, it was extraordinary. But I need you to understand something important. You are now our key witness, and that means you're also in danger, he explained, his voice gentle but serious. Avery nodded slowly, the reality of her situation beginning to sink in. She was no longer just a homeless girl, ignored and invisible to society. Now she was someone important, someone who had valuable and dangerous information. The feeling was strange, a mixture of pride and fear that made her stomach twist. Her small hands tightened around the water bottle as she tried to process everything that was happening. What's going to happen to me now? And Judge Alexander? Will he survive? And Miles? Will he be arrested? And the businessman who paid for all this? The questions came out in an anxious torrent, each reflecting the various fears and hopes fighting within her. The investigator picked up his phone when it vibrated with a message. His eyes quickly scanned the screen, and a small smile of satisfaction appeared on his face. He put the device back in his pocket and turned his attention to Avery, his expression now more reassuring. Judge Alexander is stable. The doctors were able to identify the poison thanks to the vial we found and are administering the appropriate treatment. As for Miles, he's being detained right now. The businessman will also be arrested in the next few hours, as well as several others involved in the scheme. As for you, Avery, we need to keep you safe. These people are powerful and have many resources, he informed her, his voice carrying the seriousness appropriate to the situation. The door opened again, and the woman returned, accompanied by a uniformed officer Avery hadn't seen before. Both looked agitated, as if something unexpected had occurred. The lead investigator immediately stood up, his body tense in anticipation of news that clearly wasn't good. Avery watched, her heart accelerating with a new fear. Miles is detained, but there was a problem during the arrest. He made a scene, shouting accusations against the girl, claiming she was planted by the prosecution to ruin him. The businessman is already mobilizing his team of lawyers, accusing us of fabricating evidence and using a vulnerable child as a pawn. They're trying to discredit everything, especially her testimony, the woman reported, her urgent tone revealing the gravity of the situation. The lead investigator ran his hand through his hair, clearly disturbed by this development. Avery felt a chill in her stomach as she realized that even with physical evidence, her word was still being questioned. The powerful people she had confronted wouldn't give up easily, and now they were trying to transform her, the victim and witness, into part of a fabricated conspiracy. They're trying to turn the situation around, make it seem like I'm part of a plot against them. But I just wanted to help Judge Alexander. I had never seen any of these people before that night in the rain. How can they say I was planted by someone? Protested Avery, her voice rising with indignation, tears of frustration threatening to form in her tired eyes. The uniformed officer approached, handing a document to the lead investigator, who read it quickly, his face hardening with each line. When he finished, he carefully folded the paper and placed it in the inner pocket of his jacket, as if wanting to protect Avery from its contents. But she had seen his expression change and knew something serious was happening. "What is it?" "What's written on that paper? Please don't hide anything from me. I've been through too much to be treated like a child who can't handle the truth," Avery pleaded, her maturity forced by circumstances evident in every word. The woman exchanged a meaningful look with the investigator, who nodded slightly, giving silent permission for her to explain the situation. Pulling a chair to sit beside Avery, the woman tried to soften the blow, but maintained the honesty that the girl clearly deserved. "The businessman is using his influence to try to discredit you, Avery. He claims your story is absurd, that a child couldn't simply stumble upon a conspiracy of this caliber. His lawyers are questioning your mental sanity, suggesting that you might be suffering from delusions due to the trauma of abandonment. They're trying to create doubts about everything despite the physical evidence," she explained, her barely contained indignation showing through in every word. Avery felt a wave of anger and despair. It was unfair. After everything she had gone through, after risking everything to save a stranger's life, she was still being treated as someone whose words had no value. The injustice of the situation was almost unbearable, and for a moment, she wished she had never gotten involved, never tried to do the right thing. Why do powerful people always get away? Why does nobody believe those who don't have money or influence? I saw what I saw, heard what I heard, and yet they can simply say I'm crazy or lying, and people believe them," questioned Avery, her voice choked with emotion, her small fists clenched in frustration. The lead investigator knelt before her, his eyes now level with hers. There was something in his expression that Avery hadn't seen before, genuine respect, mixed with determination. When he spoke, his voice was firm and confident, carrying an implicit promise. "Avery, I want you to know something. We believe you, and we have physical evidence that corroborates your story. They may try to discredit you, they may use their money and influence to create doubts, but truth has a way of prevailing. We're not giving up on this case, and we won't let you face this alone," he assured her, an unwavering conviction in every word. The door opened once more, and another officer hurriedly entered, his face lit with an expression of triumph that immediately captured everyone's attention in the room. He seemed almost breathless, as if he had run to bring the news he carried. "We found more documents in Miles's office. He kept detailed records of all transactions as a kind of personal insurance. There are receipts, dates, amounts, names, everything meticulously documented, and there's more. There are recordings. Apparently, he secretly recorded all conversations with the businessman as a guarantee. We have everything on audio," announced the officer, his voice laden with barely contained excitement. The atmosphere in the room instantly transformed. Where before there had been concern and frustration, now there was a palpable sense of vindication. The lead investigator stood up, a genuine smile forming on his face for the first time since Avery had met him. The woman was taking notes quickly, already planning the next steps of the investigation. It was as if a dark cloud had suddenly dissipated, allowing the light of truth to finally shine. This changes everything. With recordings and detailed records, Avery's testimony is independently corroborated. Not even the most expensive lawyers can refute such concrete evidence. "The case is practically solved," declared the investigator, evident professional satisfaction in his voice. Avery felt a wave of relief wash over her tired body. The tears she had been holding back finally escaped, but they were tears of relief, not sadness or fear. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe that everything would be all right, that justice would truly prevail. But there was still an important question that no one had answered. What's going to happen to me now? I have nowhere to go, I have no one. My stepmother kicked me out, and after all this, I can't simply return to the streets. I'm scared, confessed Avery, her small voice reminding everyone in the room that despite her extraordinary courage, she was still just a vulnerable and lonely child. Before anyone could answer, the phone rang again. The younger officer answered, listening attentively for a few moments before hanging up. His expression was grave when he turned to the group, especially to Avery. The mood in the room changed once more, tension returning like an invisible wave. Miles is being transferred to maximum security prison while awaiting trial. But during the transfer, he made a public statement in front of journalists and cameras. He looked directly into the lenses and said, "That girl won't live to testify at the main trial." It was an explicit threat, broadcast live, reported the officer, the silence that followed weighing like lead on everyone present. Avery felt her blood freeze in her veins. The reality of the situation she found herself in hit her with full force. She wasn't just a witness in a corruption case. She was the target of a public threat made by a desperate and dangerous man, a man with connections and resources. Her small body trembled involuntarily, and she hugged her own torso as if trying to physically protect herself from the invisible but very real threat hanging over her. He really said that? In front of everyone? But why? That only makes him look more guilty, doesn't it? Unless he's sure he has people on the outside who can carry out that threat, whispered Avery, her voice almost inaudible, but carrying a frighteningly adult understanding of the situation. Autumn had arrived in the city, painting the trees in the central square with golden and reddish tones. The gentle wind occasionally pulled some dry leaves from the branches, making them dance in the air before softly landing on the ground. Sitting on a worn bench, Avery observed this natural ballet with tired but attentive eyes. 3 weeks had passed since the incident in court, 3 weeks in which her life had not improved as she had secretly hoped. After her testimony and Miles's arrest, the authorities seemed to simply forget about her. No shelter, no follow-up, no assistance of any kind. Like so many times in her short life, Avery had been used and then discarded when her usefulness came to an end. It's always like this, isn't it? People care when they need you, and then they just go on with their lives as if you didn't exist. At least Judge Alexander survived. That has to count for something, she muttered to herself as her stomach painfully growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten anything since the day before. The central square was one of the few places where Avery felt relatively safe. During the day, the constant movement of people offered a certain protection, and the fountain in the center attracted tourists and pigeons in equal measure, creating an almost festive atmosphere that dramatically contrasted with her reality. There she had found other homeless people who, recognizing the vulnerability of the small girl, offered what they could. A piece of bread here, an old blanket there, tips on where to get clean water or where to sleep with relative safety. Her appearance had changed in these weeks, thinner with deep circles under eyes that once shone with childish hope, tangled hair that hadn't seen a brush in a long time. Maybe I should try the church again. The soup lady will be there today, and she always gives me an extra portion when there's leftover. Or is it bread day at the corner bakery? I'm losing track of the days, thought Avery, trying to formulate a plan to get her next meal. A stronger breeze shook the branches above her head, causing a shower of golden leaves to fall on the bench where she was sitting. Avery raised her face, allowing some to land on her hair and shoulders, a rare moment of childish abandonment in an existence that forced her to mature too quickly. Her thoughts wandered to Judge Alexander. Had he completely survived the poisoning? Did he have sequelae? News about the case had quickly disappeared from newspapers and street conversations, replaced by new scandals and tragedies, the relentless cycle of urban life that doesn't stop for anyone, especially for those on the margins of society. I hope he's okay, that he's gone back to his family, to the people who love him. At least one of us should have a happy ending in this whole story, sighed Avery, brushing away a leaf that had landed on her nose, a small, sad smile forming on her chapped lips. Across the square, a middle-aged man walked slowly, leaning slightly on a cane. His tall, distinguished figure attracted some curious glances from passers-by, not just because of the cane, clearly a temporary aid, not a permanent necessity, but for the determination evident in each careful step. Judge Alexander had been discharged from the hospital just 2 days earlier, against medical recommendations for prolonged rest. His recovery, although remarkable considering the potency of the poison that had almost taken his life, was still ongoing. But there was something he needed to do, something that couldn't wait another day. Find the girl who had risked everything to save him, the brave child whom the authorities had neglected after the case. She has to be somewhere in this city. How can they simply lose a child like that? How can they be so indifferent after everything she did? The judge muttered to himself, indignation fueling his determination as his eyes scanned every corner of the square. Alexander's previous attempts to locate Avery through official channels had been frustratingly fruitless. The system, which he had faithfully served for decades, had shown its coldest and most bureaucratic face. Incomplete reports, responsibilities transferred between departments, empty promises of follow-up. When he finally gathered the strength to leave the hospital, he decided to take matters into his own hands. Over the past 2 days, he had visited shelters, talked to social workers, and visited places where homeless people usually gathered. This morning, finally, a glimmer of hope. An elderly lady who distributed soup had mentioned a brave little girl who frequented the central square. "I've covered almost the entire square and nothing. Was the information wrong? Or perhaps she only comes at a different time. I can't give up now, not when I'm so close," thought Alexander, feeling the fatigue weighing on his body still weakened by the long hospitalization. A few meters away, a group of pigeons eagerly fought over breadcrumbs that an elderly man was throwing on the ground. The sudden noise of their flapping wings startled Avery, making her look in that direction. It was then that her eyes caught a familiar figure across the square, a tall man with graying hair, leaning on a cane. Even at a distance, even with a more haggard appearance than she remembered, there was no doubt. It was Judge Alexander. Her heart immediately raced, a confused mixture of emotions taking over. Joy to see him alive and apparently recovered, fear of what his presence there might mean, stubborn hope she tried to suppress before it could take root. "It's him. He's alive, he's walking. But what is he doing here? Could he be looking for me? No, that would be expecting too much. He's probably just taking a walk, regaining his strength," Avery tried to convince herself while unconsciously shrinking on the bench, a learned reflex of someone who has learned not to draw attention. Alexander paused for a moment, leaning more heavily on his cane while catching his breath. Recovery was slower than he would like to admit, each step requiring an effort he never showed in court, where his presence had always been synonymous with strength and authority. His eyes continued to methodically examine each bench, each corner of the square, determined not to miss any detail. It was then that he noticed, partially hidden by the shadow of a large tree, the small figure sitting alone on a distant bench. Even from that distance, even with a more deteriorated appearance than he remembered, his heart knew before his mind did. It was her, the girl who had burst into his courtroom shouting about poisoned water, the child everyone had ignored. "My God, it's her, I finally found her. But look at her, so thin, so alone. How could they abandon her like this after everything she did? How could I have taken so long to come looking for her?" thought Alexander, a wave of emotion almost making him stagger as he resumed his walk, now with a defined direction. Avery watched, petrified, as Judge Alexander clearly spotted her and began walking toward her. Her first instinct was to flee, run away, hide, protect herself from another possible disappointment. But something kept her glued to the bench, perhaps exhaustion, perhaps curiosity, or perhaps that small spark of hope that refused to die completely, no matter how many times life tried to extinguish it. Her small hands gripped the edge of the bench tightly, as if seeking some stability in a world that constantly moved beneath her feet. "He recognized me. He's coming here. What should I do? What should I say? What if he's angry because I caused all that commotion in court? Or worse, what if he just wants to thank me quickly and leave, leaving me here again?" The questions tumbled through her mind as she watched the judge's slow but determined approach. Each step Alexander took toward the bench seemed to carry the weight of an immense responsibility. In his mind, he reviewed the words he had planned to say, the questions he needed to ask, the thanks that no language seemed adequate to express. How to thank someone for your life. How to compensate a child who sacrificed her own safety to save a stranger. As he approached, the details of Avery's condition became more evident and painfully clear. The dirty and worn clothes, the tangled hair, the concerning thinness, the eyes that had seen much more suffering than any child should. So young and already so marked by life. While I was in the hospital, surrounded by care and attention, she was out here, alone, abandoned by everyone. What kind of justice is this that I intend to serve and defend? Thought Alexander, a knot forming in his throat as he finally reached the bench where Avery waited, motionless like a small statue. For a long moment, neither spoke. They just looked at each other, recognizing one another beyond the drastically different circumstances of their first meeting. Avery, still clinging to the bench as if it might disappear at any moment, and Alexander, leaning on his cane, searching for the right words to begin a conversation that could change two lives forever. It was the judge who finally broke the silence, his normally firm voice now trembling with barely contained emotion. "Avery? It's you, isn't it? The brave girl who burst into my courtroom to warn me about the poisoned water. The girl everyone ignored, but who never gave up trying to save the life of a complete stranger," said Alexander, his gentle voice carrying a gratitude that transcended simple words. Avery nodded slowly, still unable to formulate an adequate response. Part of her still couldn't believe that Judge Alexander was really there, looking for her, remembering her name. Another part feared that at any moment he would politely thank her and go on his way, returning to his normal life, leaving her behind as everyone else had done. Her throat was dry, and when she finally managed to speak, her voice came out as a hoarse whisper. "Are you all right? The poison. Wasn't it too late? I was worried that maybe they hadn't managed to save you in time," asked Avery, surprising herself by thinking first of his well-being, despite her own desperate situation. Alexander felt his heart tighten at the question. Even now, even after weeks living on the streets, abandoned by everyone, Avery's first concern was for him. Carefully, leaning on his cane, he sat down on the bench beside her, respecting a distance that wouldn't intimidate her. His eyes, normally stern after decades presiding over the court's most difficult cases, were now soft and emotional. "I'm alive thanks to you, Avery. The doctors said that if I had drunk all the contents of the cup, or if the treatment had been delayed a few more hours, there would have been nothing they could do. Your courage gave me a second chance at life. And that's why I've spent the last few days looking for you, as soon as I had the strength to leave the hospital," explained Alexander, his voice gaining firmness as he spoke, emotion giving way to determination. Confusion showed on Avery's face. He had been looking for her. Deliberately, it wasn't a casual encounter. The idea that someone had gone to the trouble of looking for her was so strange, so contrary to everything she had experienced in recent weeks, that she had difficulty processing it. Her fingers finally released the edge of the bench, and she turned a little more toward the judge, her body language beginning to open up, still cautious, but no longer completely defensive. "You were looking for me. Why?" "I've already given my testimony, told everything I knew about Miles and the businessman. I have nothing more to offer," asked Avery, genuinely confused about what could be the reason for this search. The question, so innocent and at the same time so revealing of the life Avery had led, hit Alexander like a physical blow. Of course she would think that way, that she would only be sought out if she had something to offer, some utility. In her world, people didn't look for her simply because they cared about her. The judge took a deep breath, searching for the right words to explain something that went far beyond duty or formal gratitude. "I'm not here because of the case, Avery. I'm here because of you. To thank you personally, yes, but mainly to find out how you are, what happened to you afterward. When I discovered that nobody had properly taken care of your welfare after your testimony, I was furious, to be honest. You saved my life and were simply forgotten," explained Alexander, the indignation evident in his normally controlled voice. A bird landed near them, curious and fearless as only plaza birds can be, momentarily breaking the intensity of the moment. Avery observed him for a few seconds, using that small distraction to organize her thoughts, to process what she was hearing. When she looked back at Judge Alexander, there was something different in her eyes, a timid glimmer of hope that she hadn't allowed herself to feel for a long time. "After I gave my testimony, they told me they would get in touch to arrange temporary shelter. I waited at the address I provided for 2 days, but no one showed up. I tried to go back to the courthouse, but they wouldn't let me in. They said the case was confidential and that I should seek social services. At social services, they said they had no record of my case and that they should be contacted by the court. After a few attempts, I realized that nobody really cared, and I went back to the streets, Avery reported, her voice surprisingly devoid of bitterness, as if she were merely stating facts she had already expected. Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, the shame for the system he represented weighing on his already tired shoulders. The bureaucracy, the communication failures, the institutional indifference, everything he had criticized during his career had materialized in the treatment given to this child who had risked everything to do the right thing. When he reopened his eyes, there was a renewed determination in them, a silent promise that things would be different from that moment on. "I'm sorry, Avery, deeply. The system that should have protected you failed terribly. If I hadn't been in the hospital, I would have personally ensured that you received the necessary care. But I'm here now and I would like to do whatever I can to help you. Tell me, what would you like? Anything. Consider it as a thank you for saving my life," Alexander offered, leaning slightly forward, eager to finally do something concrete for this extraordinary child. The question caught Avery completely off guard. What would she like? Nobody had asked her that in, well, maybe never. Her life had been a series of orders, obligations, rejections, and basic survival. The idea that she could desire something, ask for something, was as strange as the idea that someone actually cared about her. For a moment she remained silent, looking at her own dirty hands, at the scratches and calluses that shouldn't exist on the hands of an 8-year-old child. I don't know. No one has ever asked me that before. What can I ask for? You're an important judge. You must be busy. You have your own family, your responsibilities. I don't want to be a bother, Avery responded, her voice almost disappearing at the end, the insecurity of someone who has learned to expect nothing clearly revealing itself. Alexander felt tears forming in his eyes, but made no effort to contain them. He let them flow freely down his face, a visible testimony to the emotion he felt. In decades at the court, he had heard the most horrible crimes, the most disturbing testimonies, and had always maintained professional composure. But here, before this little girl who couldn't even imagine that she deserved to ask something for herself, his professional facade completely crumbled. Avery, you are not a bother. You are probably the bravest and most selfless person I've ever met. And yes, I am a judge, I have responsibilities, but I don't have family waiting for me at home. My wife passed away many years ago, we didn't have children. So please don't worry about asking for too much. On the contrary, worry about asking for enough, Alexander explained, his voice choked with emotion, but firm in his sincerity. Judge Alexander's words slowly penetrated the layers of protection that Avery had built around her heart. The revelation that he too was alone in the world in a way created an unexpected connection between them. Her eyes, normally cautious and distrustful after so many disappointments, began to show a different shine, something that could be genuine hope. She took a deep breath, gathering courage to express a desire she had kept buried for so long, fearing that merely verbalizing it could make its eventual rejection even more painful. If I could ask for anything in the world, I just want a family, a home, food, and someone who truly loves me. I don't need expensive toys or pretty clothes. I just want to belong somewhere, to feel that I matter to someone, not to be afraid to fall asleep because I don't know if I'll be safe or if I'll have something to eat the next day, Avery confessed, tears finally escaping from her eyes, creating clean trails on her dirty face. The request, so simple and yet so profound, struck Alexander at the center of his being. Not jewels, not trips, not material objects or extravagant requests. They were the most basic needs that any child should have by right, not as a favor or reward. And the fact that Avery considered this as anything in the world showed how low her expectations had become, how little she believed she deserved. An unwavering determination formed within him, as strong as any verdict he had ever delivered in his long career. Avery, this is a request I intend to honor with all my heart. But first, I need to fully understand how you came to this situation. You mentioned a stepmother before. Could you tell me more about her, about how you ended up on the streets? This will help me ensure that we can create a permanent solution, not just a temporary one, Alexander asked gently, aware that he was asking Avery to revisit painful memories. Avery wiped her tears with the dirty sleeve of her blouse, a gesture so childish and vulnerable that it dramatically contrasted with the forced maturity she had demonstrated until then. For a moment she hesitated. Talking about Stella meant reliving the rejection, the injustice, the pain of being expelled from the only home she had known. But there was something in Judge Alexander's expression, a sincerity in his eyes that made her believe that this time, perhaps, telling her story could lead to a different outcome. My father died 3 years ago. He was good, kind, loved me very much. I never had a mother, she died when I was born. A year after my dad passed away, Stella, my stepmother, completely changed with me. Before she pretended to like me when my father was alive, then she showed who she really was. On the night of the storm, she accused me of stealing money from her, said I was a thief, just like my father, but I never stole anything, I swear. She kicked me out in the middle of the night in the rain, with nothing but the clothes on my back. Avery recounted, the words coming out in an emotional torrent, as if she had waited a long time to finally share her story with someone who would really listen. Alexander listened attentively, each of Avery's words increasing his indignation at the injustice she had suffered, but also his determination to correct these wrongs. As a judge, he had dedicated his life to justice, but rarely had the opportunity to so directly influence someone's fate, especially someone so deserving of a second chance. His mind was already working on the legal possibilities, the necessary procedures, the resources he could mobilize. Avery, what your stepmother did is a crime. Abandonment of a dependent, child neglect. And if she falsely accused you to justify the expulsion, this suggests there may be other motives behind her actions, perhaps related to inheritance or assets left by your father. I promise to investigate this thoroughly. No one should go through what you went through, and Stella needs to answer for her actions before the law, Alexander declared, his voice regaining some of the judicial authority that characterized him in court, but now directed towards Avery's protection, not her intimidation. Weeks later, the morning sun filtered through the large windows of the Court of Justice, creating golden patterns on the polished marble floor. This hearing room, different from the one where Avery had made her dramatic intervention months ago, had a more welcoming air, with dark wood panels on the walls and softer lighting. Beside Avery, Judge Alexander maintained a serene expression, although his eyes betrayed the anxiety he felt. After that meeting in the square, his life had completely transformed. Using his influence and knowledge of the system, he had managed to open a case against Stella for abandonment of a dependent and child neglect. Simultaneously, he had initiated procedures to obtain temporary custody of Avery, finally providing her with the stability and security she so deserved. The past weeks had been intense. Testimonies, investigations, preliminary hearings, but also deeply rewarding as he built a relationship of trust and affection with the girl who had saved his life. Today is the day Avery will finally be able to close this painful chapter of her life and truly begin a new one. No matter what happens, she will never be alone again, I promise, Alexander said to himself, as he gently placed his hand on the girl's shoulder in a gesture of support. The side door of the room opened, and Stella entered, escorted by a bailiff. Her face, once arrogant and confident in her impunity, now showed the marks of stress and worry. Her eyes, cold as always, quickly scanned the room until they rested on Avery. For a brief moment, an expression of shock passed across her face. She clearly didn't expect to see her stepdaughter so transformed. The Avery who now faced her was no longer the frightened and undernourished girl she had expelled during the storm. With clean clothes, well-groomed hair, and a posture that reflected her growing self-confidence, she was the living image of childhood resilience. The new judge, a middle-aged man with a severe but fair expression, took his place on the bench and declared the session open. His gaze lingered for a moment on Avery, softening almost imperceptibly, before returning to the formality necessary to conduct the trial. We are here today for the case of Stella Turner, accused of child abandonment and neglect against her minor stepdaughter, Avery Turner. The prosecution may present its opening statements, announced the judge, his voice resonating clearly and authoritatively through the silent room. The prosecutor rose, briefly adjusting his documents before beginning his presentation. With precise and impactful words, he described the night of the storm, when Stella had expelled Avery from home with a false accusation of theft, Ladies and gentlemen, this was not a simple moment of anger or an error in judgment. The evidence will show that it was a calculated act, motivated by greed. Stella Turner wanted to get rid of the only person preventing her from taking full control of the inheritance left by Avery's father, stated the prosecutor, his voice carrying controlled indignation. Avery felt a shiver run down her spine upon hearing the mention of her father's inheritance. During the preliminary investigations, a shocking truth had emerged. Her father had left a considerable sum and a house in her name, with Stella designated only as a temporary administrator until Avery reached adulthood. The defense attorney tried to build a case around Avery's alleged chronic misbehavior and the challenges of raising a troubled child, but his claims sounded hollow in the face of the compelling evidence presented by the prosecution. Witnesses were called: neighbors who had witnessed Stella's cold treatment toward her stepdaughter, teachers who noticed signs of neglect but did not intervene, and even the accountant who had warned Stella about the illegality of her financial maneuvers with the inheritance. With each new testimony, Stella's expression grew darker, the reality of her situation finally hitting her with full force. "I never thought I would be discovered. That stupid girl should have frozen to death that night, or at least disappeared forever. How could I predict she would end up saving a judge and becoming a little celebrity?" Stella muttered to herself, not realizing her microphone was on, her incriminating words echoing throughout the courtroom. A shocked murmur ran through the audience, and the substitute judge had to bang his gavel to restore order. Stella's face paled as she realized her fatal mistake, her own words sealing her fate more effectively than any evidence presented until then. Avery, however, showed no surprise or shock. Somehow she had always known the truth about her stepmother's feelings, even when she desperately tried to win her affection in the first years after her father's death. "She never wanted me, not even for a minute. All that pretending when Dad was alive, all those fake smiles. It was all for the money, never for me," Avery understood, a solitary tear running down her face as she definitively closed that chapter of her life. Alexander, sensing Avery's pain, gently held her hand, offering the silent support she so needed in that moment. His own indignation against Stella had transformed into something more complex. Gratitude for the tortuous path that had brought Avery into his life, mixed with a fierce determination to ensure she never again suffered such abandonment and betrayal. In the months he had cared for Avery as a temporary guardian, he had discovered a purpose and joy he thought he had lost forever after his wife's death years ago. Sometimes, life's greatest blessings arrive through the most unlikely circumstances. Who would have imagined that small intruder in my courtroom would become the light that was missing in my life? Alexander reflected, a gentle smile forming on his lips as he reassuringly squeezed Avery's hand. After the final presentation of evidence, the substitute judge called Avery to testify. With hesitant but determined steps, she approached the witness chair, appearing simultaneously small and immense in that solemn environment. Her voice, initially trembling, gained strength as she recounted her life with Stella after her father's death. The small and large acts of cruelty, the cutting words, the complete absence of affection or care. She described the night of the storm in vivid detail. The terror of being expelled in the middle of the torrential rain, the hunger and cold she had faced, and finally, the makeshift shelter that had led her to accidentally witness the conspiracy against Judge Alexander. "I just wanted a place to hide from the rain. I never imagined I would end up hearing plans to kill someone. I was so scared, but I knew I needed to do something even if no one believed me," explained Avery, her raw honesty touching even the hardest hearts in the room. The defense attorney, clearly uncomfortable with the task of questioning a child whose story had already moved the entire room, asked a few superficial questions about the alleged theft of the money. Avery, with surprising maturity, calmly answered that she had never taken anything that didn't belong to her, and that she didn't even know about the existence of the inheritance left by her father until the recent investigations. Her sincerity dramatically contrasted with Stella's evasive behavior during her own testimony, creating a parallel that didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the courtroom. "Why would I steal something from someone who was supposedly taking care of me? All I wanted was to be loved, to be treated like family. Money was never important to me, I just wanted her to accept me," answered Avery, simple words that carried the weight of years of rejection and yearning for belonging. As Avery returned to her place beside Alexander, Stella's gaze followed her with a mixture of anger and something that could almost be interpreted as regret, not for the actions themselves, but for having completely underestimated the girl she considered weak and insignificant. The same child she had thrown onto the street to die had not only survived but thrived, and now was about to recover everything that was legitimately hers, including the dignity that Stella had tried so hard to destroy. How did this brat manage to turn things around like this? She should have disappeared, been just another statistic, another child lost in the system. Instead, she's here, looking almost happy, Stella thought bitterly, envy distorting her features as she observed the obvious connection between Avery and Judge Alexander. After the final arguments from both sides, the substitute judge withdrew to deliberate. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone awaited the verdict. Alexander maintained a calm expression, but his fingers lightly drummed on his knee, the only visible sign of his anxiety. He wasn't worried about the outcome of Stella's trial. The evidence against her was overwhelming. His concern centered on the second decision the court would have to make that day, his formal request to adopt Avery, transforming the temporary guardianship into a permanent and legal bond. What if the judge decides I'm not suitable to raise a child? I'm of advanced age, have a demanding job, have lived alone for years. There are so many reasons why they might deny my request, so many reasons why they might consider that Avery deserves a more conventional family, Alexander worried, his internal doubts contrasting with the confidence he tried to project to reassure Avery. The wait seemed endless, but finally the substitute judge returned to the room. Everyone stood up again, and Avery instinctively held Alexander's hand, seeking security in the face of the decisive moment that would define her future. The silence was absolute when the judge began to speak, his deep and clear voice echoing to the farthest corners of the room. With formal but incisive words, he declared Stella guilty of all charges: abandonment of a dependent, child neglect, misappropriation of inheritance funds, and document fraud. The sentence was severe: years in prison, complete restitution of the diverted funds, and permanent loss of any rights over Avery or the assets left by her father. Society trusts adults to protect their children, not to exploit them. The court considers the defendant's actions particularly heinous, given the relationship of trust that should exist between stepmother and stepdaughter. There are no mitigating circumstances that justify such a betrayal of trust, declared the judge, his voice carrying the moral weight of the conviction. Stella seemed to have shrunk several inches in her chair, all her previous arrogance replaced by a reluctant acceptance of her defeat. When the officers approached to escort her, she cast one last look at Avery, not of anger or hatred as would be expected, but of something surprisingly close to reluctant respect. For a brief moment, their gazes crossed across the room, a silent acknowledgement that the battle between them had ended, with Avery emerging not just victorious, but whole in a way that Stella would never fully understand. I never imagined she had so much strength inside that fragile little body. Perhaps if I had really looked at her, really tried to know her instead of seeing her just as an obstacle. Things could have been different for both of us, thought Stella, a rare moment of introspection arising too late as she was led out of the room. The substitute judge cleared his throat, drawing the room's attention back to himself. The criminal case had been concluded, but there was still the matter of Avery's permanent custody. Alexander straightened in his seat, his serene expression masking the whirlwind of emotions inside him. Beside him, Avery barely breathed, her eyes fixed on the judge as if trying to read the decision in advance from his carefully neutral expression. The last few months with Alexander had been the happiest she remembered since her father's death, but life had harshly taught her that happiness could be ephemeral, that people could disappear, that promises could be broken. Please, please let me stay with him. He's the only person who has really cared about me since Dad. He makes me feel safe, makes me feel that I matter, Avery silently prayed, her small hands squeezing each other so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The substitute judge began to speak, his voice now softer, almost paternal, very different from the severe tone used for Stella's sentencing. He mentioned the formal adoption request submitted by Judge Alexander, the extremely positive reports from social workers who had monitored the temporary guardianship period, the psychological evaluations indicating the strong bond already formed between them, and the evident positive transformation in Avery's life since finding stability and affection under the judge's care. In my 20 years on this bench, I have rarely witnessed such a genuine and beneficial connection between an adoption candidate and a child. What began as a fortuitous and dramatic encounter has transformed into a relationship of mutual respect, affection, and support that clearly benefits both parties, the judge observed, a slight smile softening his normally austere expression. Avery's heart quickened, hope blossoming in her chest like a small bird testing its wings for the first time. The judge's words sounded positive, but she still feared allowing herself to fully believe after so many disappointments. Beside her, Alexander remained outwardly composed, but his breathing had become faster, and a drop of sweat was forming on his temple, subtle signs of the importance of this moment to him. It wasn't just about giving a home to a child in need. It was about rebuilding a family, about filling the void that both had carried for years. Please, God, let this be the right decision for Avery. She deserves stability, deserves love, deserves a real chance to simply be a child after being forced to grow up so quickly, Alexander prayed silently while awaiting the judge's final words. Finally, with the solemnity appropriate for a moment that would forever change two lives, the substitute judge delivered his decision. This court grants full and irrevocable adoption of Avery Turner to the petitioner, Judge Alexander Thompson. All parental rights and responsibilities are officially transferred from this moment. The sound of the gavel hitting the bench echoed through the room, formally sealing a union that, in truth, had already existed in both their hearts since that meeting in the square months ago. For a moment, no one moved, as if time had frozen in that perfect instant. It's official. It's real. It's not temporary. It's not conditional. I have a family. I have a father. I belong somewhere to someone, thought Avery, tears of joy blurring her vision as reality finally penetrated her consciousness. The silence was broken by spontaneous applause that began at the back of the room and quickly spread, creating a wave of approval and celebration that seemed to envelop Avery and Alexander in a collective embrace. Court officials, lawyers, spectators, people who normally maintained professional composure, even in the most emotional circumstances, were visibly moved, some discreetly wiping away tears. It was as if everyone in the room recognized that they were witnessing not just the happy ending of a legal case, but the perfect conclusion of an extraordinary journey that had begun in darkness and now ended in the brightest light. Your official adoption documents will be ready for signature at the court clerk's office. Congratulations to both of you, and may this new family find all the happiness it clearly deserves, concluded the judge, allowing himself a complete smile as he observed the scene before him, a rare moment of pure joy in an environment that more frequently witnessed the darker complexities of human nature. Avery remained motionless for a few seconds, as if fearing that any movement might break the spell, causing everything to reveal itself as merely an elaborate dream. It was Alexander who finally broke the moment of paralysis, kneeling in front of her, so their eyes were at the same level. His hands gently held Avery's small shoulders as he searched for the right words for this moment he had imagined so many times. Avery, since the day you came running into that courtroom shouting for me not to drink that water, you not only saved my life, you completely transformed it. I know nothing can replace your biological father, and I would never try to take his place in your memories. But I promise to be the best father I can for you from now on, to be by your side every step of the way, to ensure you never again feel alone or abandoned, promised Alexander, his voice choked with emotion, but firm in its absolute sincerity. The last barriers around Avery's heart completely crumbled with those words. The hesitation, the fear, the emotional scars from years of rejection, all were momentarily swept away by a wave of pure joy and acceptance. With a small sob that was simultaneously laughter and crying, she lunged forward, throwing her arms around Alexander's neck in a hug so tight it almost unbalanced him. No elaborate words were necessary to express what she felt. That desperate embrace said everything that needed to be said. "Dad, can I call you Dad?" whispered Avery against his shoulder, the two simple words carrying the weight of all her longing for belonging, all her desire to finally have a place to call home. Alexander felt his heart expand with an emotion so intense it almost physically hurt. That single word, Dad, was the most precious gift he could have received, more valuable than any title or honor in his long legal career. Rising to his feet, he lifted Avery in his arms, spinning her in the air while laughing and crying simultaneously, indifferent to the conventions of decorum that normally governed his behavior in public, especially in court. In that moment, he wasn't a respected judge celebrating a legal victory. He was simply a father, celebrating the miracle of his new daughter. "Yes, my dear, I would be honored beyond words if you called me Dad. And I promise to do everything in my power to deserve that title every day for the rest of my life," replied Alexander, gently placing her back on the ground, but keeping her close in a protective half-embrace. The courtroom gradually began to empty, people dispersing with smiles and occasional nods of approval for the new family. Alexander and Avery remained for a few moments, absorbing the magnitude of what had just happened, allowing the reality of their new situation to fully settle in. Finally, with light steps that dramatically contrasted with the tension they had felt upon entering the courthouse hours earlier, they headed for the door. At the threshold, Alexander extended his hand, and Avery placed her small hand in his without hesitation, a simple gesture that symbolized the trust they had built, the bond that was now officially recognized by law, but that had existed in their hearts for a long time. "Let's go home, Avery. Our home," said Alexander, the simple words carrying the weight of a promise of a future, of a new beginning for both. Side by side, hand in hand, father and daughter walked through the courthouse doors toward the bright light of the sunny day. The contrast couldn't be more perfect, from the shadows of the courtroom to the clarity of the outside world, from uncertainty to security, from loneliness to family. The path that had brought them here had been winding and at times painful, full of obstacles that seemed insurmountable. But now together, they would face any future challenge not as isolated individuals, but as a family, united not by blood, but by something equally powerful: choice, respect, and genuine love. I think sometimes we need to go through the worst to find the best, don't we? If it weren't for the storm, the courtroom, for all the bad things, we would never have found each other, reflected Avery, looking up with a smile that illuminated her entire face as they walked together toward the future that awaited them. Now tell me in the comments where you're from and tell me, did you like this story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and check out the next one that's waiting for you here on the screen. I'll see you there.